Good. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for all for joining us today. I'm Narayan, acting president of Befria, Hongkong here in Sweden. Today we'll be talking about the Chinese government and its reach and influence in the media. So you'll see joining us today in the discussion is Swedish journalist Jojje Olsson, film critic and film studies professor Michael Tapper, and Central Secretariat, of Network Development at IPAC, Simona Mohamsson. Right, so to start us off, it'll be interesting to hear, firstly, what are your thoughts on the current state of the Chinese Communist Party and its influence in the media? Is it something that people should be concerned about? Jojje, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, obviously it's a very big reason for concern, and it also depends on which angle you're looking at this situation. Of course, in China, we all know that the media is since long ago controlled by the Communist Party, but what we have seen now, especially in the past couple of years, is that the foreign media is also getting more and more restrictions. And we have seen dozens of foreign journalists who didn't get their accreditation renewed in the past only year and a half. And of course, that also means that we will not have any independent reporting on issues like Xinjiang, and also increasingly so in Hong Kong. So not only is the Chinese media itself, the state media, controlled, but the foreign media on the ground in China is also threatened because they are having more restrictions and it's harder for them to get a new visa. And then, of course, we can see with everything that happened with Apple Daily and so on that the media in Hong Kong is going the same direction. You can see from Taiwan, where I live. I'm not there at the moment, but where I live, there has been huge disinformation campaigns from Chinese state actors, especially regarding COVID right now. And even though Taiwan is a democratic society with a good press freedom, it's also very vulnerable to this kind of disinformation campaigns. So if we see this worrying pattern where the domestic media has already been under control for a long time, and now the foreign media in China is heading in the same direction, Hong Kong and Taiwan, we can see this pattern of dots that is really taking place here. And of course, the next target, which has already begun, is to try to control also the foreign media in foreign countries, which I guess we will talk about more later, but it's being done when they are threatening journalists and medias and the civil society in Sweden and in many other democratic countries. So it's a source of concern that is growing, and you can also see very clearly the kind of pattern in which it is growing. Yeah.
Mm. And on top of that, you have the hostage politics. For instance, the 2 Canadians that are in prison now in China,
yes,
because they don't like some decisions made in the Canadian Parliament. So you have sort of gangster methods also, which is very disturbing. Sorry. I
finished my assessment here. So yeah.
Simona, did you have any thoughts on that?
I think that it's as Jojje told, he has been living very near to Hong Kong and China, but maybe it's harder for us to imagine what would happen if we would lose our freedom of speech and our press freedom over a night. I think very many of us have hard time to even imagine that. And I would say that that is one of the pillars of democracy. If you can't talk about what's happening, if you can't get news about what's happening, you're in the dark, and it's very hard for you to be able to tell people about the violence or the oppression that you're living under. So I would say the freedom of speech or the freedom of press and the freedom to organize, those are 2 pillars of democracy, and we're seeing that these are the 2 maybe first things that the Chinese Communist Party are going on when it comes to Hong Kong, and things that were promised in Hong Kong's case for the 50 years until 2047, and now not even halfway through this 50 years, it's already gone. and either you have freedom of press or you don't. You can't have something in between. There is no gray area, I would say. That's what I would like to put in this right now.
Yeah, of course, over the past decade, I think it's fair to say that it's actions like that, these restrictions on journalism and its suppression, that has shifted perception of China and the Chinese government across the globe, among a multitude of other reasons. But while from a certain point of view, it may seem as though it's all coming to a head now, the wider public perception appears to be quite slow to change. And that is in large part due to the growing influence that the Communist Party-controlled government has over the media across the world. Some of its attempts to spread that influence have been more aggressive than others. Jojje, I don't need to tell you that. Back when you made headlines here in Sweden after it came out that the Chinese ambassador to Sweden, Gui Kongyu, had threatened you and tried to dissuade you from covering China. Of course, this isn't dissimilar from what other journalists have experienced since Gui Kongyu arrived in 2017. I just wanted to talk to you about that a little bit. How has it affected your work, if at all? And did you receive any kind of support from your peers?
Yeah, thank you. I have been answering a lot of questions about this recently, so it almost comes out from the top of my head now. But of course, as you said, the Chinese ambassador has been threatening me and also other Swedish journalists and politicians and NGO employees and so on ever since he assumed his position in Sweden in 2017. And for me, this is nothing new because I was the first one who was attacked in a so-called spokesperson remarks that they do on their website. And this was already in 2017. And since then, I think that they have attacked me by name on their website, maybe 5 or 6 times they have mentioned me on the website. But what I can see starting from this year is a new strategy, if you will, on how they approach those kind of threats they're doing to journalists, and also the wording that they are using. As I said before, I was being attacked on their website when they tried to, talk about how unreliable I am and so on statements on their website. But now, starting from this year, they start to send out emails instead, individual emails, which is, they are not like public in the same way, but of course for many people it will be more threatening and more intimidating if you get a personal email from the embassy instead of an open statement. So that happened to me 3 or 4 times only this year that I got these emails from the Chinese embassy, and also the wording is getting very different. A few years ago, when they would put my name out on their embassy website, they would say things such as, yeah, I'm slandering China, I'm spreading rumors, and I'm not reliable because of this and that. But now it has instead become more common to issuing threats. So what they would do in their emails now is to first use this kind of metaphors to say that, yeah, the one who throw dirt on other people will just get his own hands dirty and so on, right? And then the last email I got a few months ago, they also said straight out that if you don't stop your reporting, you will eventually face the consequences of your actions. So it's more or less what you can say within the limits of the law, but still issuing a threat. Right? And I think that this is, for me, a sign that the Chinese authorities is getting more and more worried about the negative consequences that their actions are getting in terms of reporting in foreign media, but also attention among foreign politicians and organizations. Because this year, when I received those emails, those threatening emails, I had been writing about Xinjiang, and also the H&M boycott against H&M, which is also related to Xinjiang. And I also wrote about the potential boycott of the Olympics because of what's happening in Xinjiang. And those are all very, very sensitive questions for the Chinese authorities. And many people, not only me, but also other journalists, they got different kind of threats or attacks after having written about those specific questions. So I think Xinjiang and things that you can relate to Xinjiang, which is, of course, the boycott against H&M because of the cotton that is produced in Xinjiang. And also the Beijing Olympics and maybe a boycott of the Beijing Olympics. Those are all very sensitive issues. And I think that this, how to say, more like clumsy attacks and those more like Trump, like they are stepping up the propaganda war among those issues. It also points to a concern that they think that they're losing the information war around those positions. So it didn't really change my reporting at all, because you could say that, yeah, because of the threats, I'm going to report more about this and that, but I try to be as neutral as possible, like not report more about it or not report less about it. But what I think is important is when you get this kind of threats that you do, that you don't censor it or you don't keep quiet about it. You go public with it and say that I got these threats from the embassy, so that everyone knows what is happening. Because of course, what the Chinese government want is that you're going to keep this to yourself, and also that it's going to be something that you don't want to talk about. You can see many experts and analytics, especially if you read the Hidden Hand, the new book that came out last year, they also point out that when this kind of thing is happening, you must go public with it, so that the methods of the Communist Party is being exposed to everyone. So it didn't really alter my way of working or reporting, other than I also report about this. I also tell people about the threats themselves, which I hope is something that will also make the public understand the nature of the Communist Party. And then when it comes to support, I think that I got very good support many times when this happened, not only this year, but also back in 2017 and since then, from other Swedish media and also civil society in Sweden. There is no big media or no big organization in Sweden that is taking the stance of China or the stance of Communist Party in this issue. It has been very good to see that at other times very polarized Swedish media actually uniting behind the threats that China is issuing, not only to me, but other journalists and politicians and organizations. So on that point, I'm very happy that you can see this kind of unity and that everyone seems to understand the threat that China is constituting here, and that no one is being a useful idiot by taking China's stance. But on the other hand, when it comes to politics, I really feel that there is no support. There should be more support from me and other actors as well, organizations and medias, because when it comes to among politicians, I see mainly people they're not interested. Like, they are not defending China, but they're also very aware of not offending China. They just try to avoid the issue.
Yeah, I'm thankful actually that you mentioned the political attitude that most countries have, because I wanted to talk about Goikongju's approach being such a classic example of what people are starting to call a wolf warrior diplomacy, which, you know, the lack of a pushback is sort of almost being encouraged. Very briefly, the name encompasses the Chinese government's aggressive approach to diplomacy. The term itself has its roots in 2017's Wolf Warrior 2 film, which included a maximum reading: "When you encounter danger in a foreign land, do not give up. Please remember, at your back stands a strong motherland." Now, Michael, you've covered China extensively as well, and though Wolf Warrior 2 was obviously not the cause of the CCP's relatively recent hostility, I think that we can agree that there is something to be said about how the film and much of Chinese cinema now, especially this year, reflects the state's general shift in attitude. What are your thoughts on that topic?
I think definitely that media, and especially film, has been sort of a test balloon for Chinese government, and they have put a lot of attention to film, and that has historically the communists, since the Russian Revolution, since Lenin said that film was the most important art, they have taken a special attention to film. And in 2017, after the Party Congress, Xi Jinping called for all the cultural workers, and especially the film workers, to attend the meeting, where he lectured them on what the good approach to Chinese history and the good approach to telling the Chinese story in a good way meant. So he really put up sort of a framework for what they could do or what they were expected to do, so to say, and not to do. And I think the Wolf Warrior films and the immense success. I think the Wolf Warrior, I've written about it in a book called Historiska Fiktioner. And it's the only Chinese film that has been that is in the 100 best list, the most biggest box office successes in history. It's in number 72, and it's for the whole film history, and it's just based on the Chinese box office, because only I think 0.3% of the incomes came from countries outside of China. So it was an immense success, and it was followed up by a Wolf Warrior 2, which was even more popular. And there has also been some other films, but it's sort of a test ground also for what they can depict, a new world order under China, so to speak. The films are portraying Chinese military on the offensive on the world stage. They're out in Africa, especially Africa has been the target. Probably because there's a lot of Chinese investments in Africa. And they portray the Chinese army and the Wolf Warrior. It's a kind of an elite force within the Red Army that are protecting poor Africans in a very colonial way, actually, which would be a complete no-no in Western films. But they have a very colonial sort of standpoint, which is kind of interesting. In which the Chinese army are protecting the poor Africans from the gangster Americans that are trying to exploit them. So it's a very sort of clear scenario, which I think is what actually Xi Jinping wants the scenario to be. It's that China is the new superpower, and against them stands America, and it's these two world forces that's going to clash on the world stage. Yeah. So I think the films has been very important. It's also important to which I've also written about, that they expand a lot in the media market, in owning cinema chains. So they own Filmstaden, for instance, in Sweden. They own America's biggest film chain, AMC, the biggest American cinema chain, and they own the biggest Australian cinema chain. So they're expanding all over, and they also own one of the big Hollywood companies called Legendary Pictures, which are producing a lot of the films that you see when they mix American and Chinese actors. The Godzilla films, for instance. So they're pushing, and Hollywood it's actually a very disturbing parallel to what Nazi Germany did in the 1930s. They're actually very successful in pressing American film companies not to depict China in any critical way. No Chinese villains, no China on the world stage that are acting sort of in suspicious ways or trying to infiltrate the Western countries. I mean, if you compare to the depictions of the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 70s in spy movies and James Bond films, etc., etc. So they've been very successful in that way. And they also tried to expand in the TV market. Unfortunately, unfortunately for them, they didn't get the concession to have a big London office, which they had prepared for a number, I think more than a decade. They didn't get to open the big London office and move into the European market, but they're trying elsewhere. Maybe Hungary will be an interesting country for them, I think.
Now, I know you mentioned to me before that you've experienced a bit of hesitation from publishers when trying to get your book covering Chinese film under Xi Jinping published. Simona, I know you've just Hong Kong RP. How difficult or easy has it been to push the importance of the topic of China and Hong Kong for your book?
It has been very important, and one part of the book is actually about the Swedish bookkeeper Gui Minhai, and I would say that we need to see this in a bigger perspective, and both Jojje and Michael were talking about it a bit, to see this as a bigger thing than just silencing people in Hong Kong or people in China or people that are journalists about China. Is about trying to test how far you can go before getting anything back. And as Jojje said, the Swedish politician have been too silent about this. We have a Swedish citizenship that has a citizen that is being threatened by one of the greatest, the biggest countries in the world, and we're not doing anything about this. We're not even kicking out the ambassador that is threatening him. I think that is it shows weakness, and shows also weakness about our system, because I would say, in a broader sense, China is exactly knowing what they are doing. When they took Gui Minhai, it wasn't just about Gui Minhai, it was about showing to the other people that were writing books or having books that were Western positive, that if you go through one step more, you can end up like Gui Minhai. But what they are doing with Jojje, or what they are doing with the new law, using it to shut down Apple Daily, is to show not just for other journalists to be silent, but also people to get self-censored, because that's what's happening. If you censor the journalists, people will start to censor themselves around a dinner table because they don't know what's okay to say and not. And I would say, of course, that was a very big, important part for me to get in the book, because when I was writing the book, most of the time it was in a pandemic, so I needed to use the digital era as everybody else, and it was very clear that after the national security law, people were more scared. Some of my friends wouldn't have contact for several months because they didn't know if they could have contact and which contacts that would be secure. So of course they know what they are doing, and I think we're very naive to think that they are just doing this for fun. They go to journalists and make them discredited, because that is what journalists are proud about. If they take a human rights lawyer, they doubt his morals, because that is the most important thing about a lawyer. So they know exactly what they're doing, and it's about not only breaking the person, but also what the person stands for. So I think, as you were talking about it, I think there will be a lot of changes. I think still that there is hope in Hong Kong for people to show some strength back. I remember once I talked to a Hong Konger who told me about the movie 10 Years. When it came, it wasn't that interesting, but the CCP put their hand inside that and said, "Oh, this is not going to be shown in Hong Kong anymore." And it overnight it flipped, and people started showing it in parks and in churches, so in community halls. So there is still I think sometimes when they do stuff, they don't expect that people will react, and that will happen in this case too. Apple Daily may be in Hong Kong dead for now, but I think there are smart people that will try to find other ways to challenge the CCP.
I'm glad you brought up the Apple Daily, because it's an example of how the national security law that was passed last year has the various freedoms, from freedom of the press to freedom of speech. We can look at other examples, like the award-winning journalist Bao Choi, who was unjustly convicted for making false statements. Journalism appears to be the free voices are being silenced. Now it's clear what the Chinese Communist Party wants for the people. They want the people to see. They want the world to see the people as part of the party. The party is China. That's always been, or generally been, the narrative. What do you think the rest of the world, including Sweden, can glean from this crackdown on media in Hong Kong? Simona, let's start with you.
Oh, it's a tough question. It's interesting that we're having this talk here today because it's the same day as the Communist Party is celebrating 100 years. I don't know if that's a celebration, but celebration of oppression. They are. I think that, like you said, that we need to do more from the. I think always that is politics and power of the people, and in politics we're too weak. I think that the Swedish ambassador, for example, should be persona non grata and should be kicked out of Sweden, and they should do this to every ambassador from China until they understand our message. That's the first thing, and then I think just talking about it and taking stand, because what we're now talking about is Hong Kong, where they took away the freedom of press, the freedom of speech. But let's talk about China also, where there is none. That's why we don't even know what's happening inside of China, where people can't even tell about their stories. And that's the biggest problem, because I think if you want people to understand how something is, you need people's stories, and people need to be able to tell their stories, but also have the security to do that. So I think in a broader sense, it can't be like Michael said, it's about America and China, and they're gonna battle it out. We need to take a stand as a European Union and show our muscles in a broader way too. We are a player to be counted in this fight again between democracy and dictatorship. I think was that an answer of your question, or was I just rambling
Yes.
like a politician?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that answered it quite well. Jojje, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter.
Yeah, so I think to begin with, we also have to realize that this state of press freedom that you have in China for a long time, and that you also getting worse and worse in Hong Kong right now, it's not an internal question for China or Hong Kong. It's something that matters for the entire world. It also gets consequences for us. And a very, very clear example of that is the ongoing pandemic that we have right now. Reporters Without Borders, they pointed out not long ago that if you had press freedom in China, the pandemic might have been contained, because then you had independent journalists who could do some reporting. You would have whistleblowers who could go to these medias that are not state controlled, and everything that is happening in China and that is not getting reported about, not taken out to the light, as to speak, is also essentially a threat not only to China but also to other people. So it's very important to realize that the lack of press freedom in China, and also now in Hong Kong and in other parts of the world where China tried to export its model, it's not only an internal or local question in those countries, it's also something that concerns us, that regards us, because it's against international resolutions, it's against international law, and it also gets consequences such as the pandemic, for instance. And then what to do about this, how to handle the situation, it's very, very hard. No one really has a solution. People often ask me, how do you think we should manage the threats against you from the Chinese ambassador? Should we cut the ties with China? Should we expel the ambassador? Should we kick out all the Chinese journalists? What should we do? I don't know, because I'm not a diplomat, and my task is more to report about what is happening on the ground. How is the regime, the Chinese authorities behaving? What are they saying? And then it's for the politicians and for the organizations and for the companies, the business society. They have to make their decisions based on our reporting and also the researchers from academics and scholars. But one thing I do know, and that is that the worst option is to do nothing at all, because that is exactly what has been happening for the past few years, when China has been pushing its positions forward and threatening journalists, not only in China but also in Hong Kong and Europe and whatnot. And this has been met with a silence at best, but also Western politicians, organizations been very inactive, and that is the exact worst, the absolute worst way to meet this threat, is to do nothing at all. Because if you see in the past 2 or 3 years, for instance, the Swedish government have the most resolute thing that they have done towards the Chinese ambassador is to say that this is not acceptable, it's unacceptable. And they have summoned the Chinese ambassador to the foreign ministry in Stockholm a few times, and they say this is not acceptable, and so on. And during the same time, the threats have worsened, not only in numbers, but also in intensity. So if you want to stop this kind of threats, you have to do something. And then it's also very important with reciprocity, I think. If you want to have some kind of reciprocity, you have to think about what would happen if the Swedish ambassador was sitting in Beijing and shouting and threatening Chinese journalists because of what they are reporting about Sweden. Of course, most likely the entire embassy would be frozen or closed or whatever. So if you want to have some kind of reciprocity with with China, you also have to think that way, right? Because that has to be the aim. And if we want to have reciprocity and we want this to change, this pattern to change, then the absolute worst solution is to continue to do nothing. So some other solutions have to be worked out for sure.
Michael, what do you think Sweden can learn from this?
I think the most important thing is that EU works together as a whole, and that they especially that they kick China where it hurts, in the wallet. I think you have to challenge the whole Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, with an EU plan to counter it. Because they are sneaking into Eastern Europe with this Belt and Road Initiative. They have a highway from Piraeus in Greece now moving up to Hungary. No surprise there. And they probably think that that way they can manage by the back door to the European economy, I think. And I think also the threat from Huawei is very real. I think they have to be frozen out of Europe as a whole, EU. And I think you have to have a plan, actually, because they have a plan. And we don't. We don't have any plan at all here. And I think it's very important that we recognize this threat and that we act together with other countries that also recognizing this threat from China. Together. That's the only way, I think, to meet this economically. Because the big business, they don't want to disturb anything. They want to be business as usual because they hope in some way the Chinese market is so big. So they are pressuring also our governments to lay low, to not disturb the relationship with China, which I think is very important in debate to recognize this, that the big business also have a voice here. And their voice is to say to our governments to be quiet, lay low. This will we don't want to disturb our business in China.
Jojje, you had something else to add?
Yeah, I totally agree here that we need to have a plan and we need to work together. But on the other hand, what we have seen now recently is that the European Union and its foreign policy have almost become an obstacle in the way that you have certain countries that is blocking statements, that is blocking actions against China. I read just yesterday before I went to bed about that the European Parliament is now considering a new resolution against Hong Kong or a new statement because of what's happening to Apple Daily. But at the same time, we have Hungary. The president have said that, well, more or less he's been bragging about that we have already blocked 7 or 8 statements against Hong Kong. So we're going to block another 100 if that's necessary. And in those circumstances, I see a lot of politicians, they are almost hiding behind the European Union's foreign policy. And they are saying to their own voters that we try to do our best within the European Union, but it's bound to fail because you have Hungary, you have Greece, you also have to a certain extent Germany, that is so, the commercial ties with China are so strong. So yes, we do need to work together within the European Union, but we also need to find alternative ways when this is not working. And yeah, that is a big challenge. And for that, I think it's important that the China issue becomes a more highlighted issue in European elections, in national elections as well. It has to become a bigger question in national politics.
Absolutely. Now, on a more grounded level, when we're discussing Hong Kong with the average person, part of the discussion is sort of influenced by the thought that Hong Kong is a relatively extreme example. But of course, from certain points of view, that's the direction that we here in Europe are headed in, or in the Western world in general. Even large companies such as Microsoft and Google, through their attempts at breaking into the Chinese market. I'm thinking of Bing's apparent censorship of the famous Tiananmen Square image that came to attention recently, the Tank Man image. And of course, YouTube has discouraged coverage or discussion of China's atrocities through various means, like demonetizing certain YouTubers. To my mind, it is something that the public needs to look out for and protest, since this impacts the media that we all consume. Everywhere, even the likes of Hollywood continues to target Chinese audiences, which of course requires satisfying state censors. So we've ended up with films like the animated Abominable, which included the controversial 9-dash line. We've seen the Taiwanese flag removed from Top Gun Maverick. We've seen the Tibetan character in Doctor Strange whitewashed to avoid upsetting Chinese censors. I think it's clear that Chinese state influence is in mainstream media. So my last question for you is, what can we do, the average people, to combat the CCP's media influence? And Michael, I'd like to start with you.
Well, as a film critic, I think I've been quite alone in highlighting those aspects of the Chinese American or Chinese only productions in Sweden. And also the fact that the biggest film chain is owned by Chinese, by Wanda, one of the biggest Chinese media companies. So I think we have to work as journalists. Me and Jojje, at least. I'm not sure what Simona does, but she has a work of her own to do. But we as journalists certainly must do our part and highlight the Chinese influence, especially in media, and take note of China's actions. I'm quite disturbed that Swedish publishers are so uninterested in publishing a book about Chinese media expansion in the West. I haven't been able to finish the book because my mother died this autumn, so it was kind of delayed. I haven't got started on it again yet, but I hope to finish it in a year or so. And I could also see it as a co-written book with other journalists in other areas, for instance, in other media fields. And also if Jojje wants to join, certainly, yeah, that could be an option. I have the American companies, publishers, especially academic presses has taken notice, and they want to publish such a book. But then you would get such a narrow audience. So China and our own governments won't take notice, and it won't be in the public debate in the same way that if it was published by a bigger publishing company like Bonniers, for instance, or Norstedts or Natur & Kultur, or one of the big American or British companies. So I'm hoping to complete my task in a year or so. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Jojje, what can we do to combat the media influence?
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned Microsoft's censorship through Bing on the Tiananmen Square anniversary last month, and Microsoft has another company called LinkedIn as well, a service rather, and they also started to censor tens or dozens or possibly even hundreds of scholars and journalists and academics and so on in the past few months, and I was one of those who were censored. So the reason for my profile being blocked in China is, well, they won't state the reason, but it's most likely because in the education section of my profile, you can see that I have written an essay about the Tiananmen Square massacre. And well, this is a censorship that LinkedIn has been stepping up since March this year, when they got some kind of instructions from the Chinese government saying that you have to be more active in your censoring of people's profiles and links and materials and so on. And this is very hard to deal with. How are you going to convince LinkedIn not to engage in this censorship? Because LinkedIn is also a private company, and they have to make their decisions on some kind of business calculation, right? And I think for every company that doesn't follow the Chinese government's instructions, there will be, of course, a big risk for economic consequences on the Chinese market. And what can we do to influence that, to combat that? There has to be some kind of consequences for the companies when they are also acting on the instructions of the Chinese government. That is my opinion, because that is the only way that you can actually convince private businesses to act not according to the Chinese instructions, but according to well, some kind of normal sense, I guess. So yeah, sanctions, of course, is a word with a very negative intonation, but I think in some cases it's actually necessary. But if not sanctions, or at least shaming, naming and shaming, and not this constant quietness, this constant silence around everything that has to do with China. Now, LinkedIn and also Bing, both are Microsoft services, they have got a lot of criticism for both the censorship of Tiananmen Square and the censorship of mine and other profiles. So I hope this naming and shaming is one way to go, but there also, in my opinion, have to be some kind of, well, political or economical or whatever consequences for a company that is also acting on the instructions of the world's biggest dictatorship, because if not, it's just going to be normalized. And from a business point of view, from a business sense, the companies will continue to act like this because they know we will only get consequences if we don't listen to China. We don't get any consequences if we don't listen to the democratic world. So again, there's a reciprocity there that has to be altered in some way.
And Simona, what do you believe that we can do?
I think that, to comment a bit on what Michael said, that we've for a very long time have been setting money against value or values, and I think that we might need to change that perception, because I think that many countries, many big companies don't even understand that they are not being on the Chinese market in a good reason. They are not being there on a fair reason as Chinese companies. And would we as a democratic countries do the same for Chinese companies, they wouldn't even want to be in our market. So talking from a political point of view, I would say maybe broadening the perspective of that sometimes even money, if money can talk, then companies need to understand that they are not being good treated in the Chinese market, and maybe that will make them understand how unfairly they are being in that kind of market. I believe in the power of the people, so I believe that we need to make people understand which companies that are in the red capital, if we want to use that kind of wording, that is directly owned by the Chinese Communist Party. And we need to talk about that there are no free companies from China. All companies are state-owned. They could be looking like they are companies, but they are owned and operated by the Chinese Communist Party. And that we need to make very clear that they are socialist understanding capitalism. And that's what's happening. They are beating us on our own game. So I think that we need to be maybe also better at telling people how to choose good or bad companies to support, and to talk more about the disadvantages of companies actually acting in China. For example, now the investment between Europe and China is on ice. I hope that would be stopped. I know that the Germans are very eager to continue having good economic relationships with China, but they need to understand that their own countries are being mistreated there. They need to see that, and maybe big companies need to understand that too. So maybe we should change the narrative of that. It's always values against money. Sometimes it's money against money, and you need to choose. I think.
Well said, well put, all of you. Now, finally, as we've mentioned, Hong Kong's Apple Daily was recently forced to cease operating on the 24th of June. To commemorate the publication and what it has come to mean for Hong Kong, supporters from all over have sent in artwork in the style of the Apple Daily's front page, the template for which was provided by artist Badiu Tao. You can take a look at the end of this stream. Now, I want to thank you all for joining us, Jojje, Simona, and Michael, everyone, and for covering Hong Kong and China as you all have. I hope to see you all again, and have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Narayan.
Thank you.
Bye.